It's time for another episode of The Sean Tappet Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Adam Blai, and we're going to be talking about his brand new book, The Exorcism Files: True Stories of Demonic Possession. Adam, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be back, Sean.
And we're going to kick this off a little bit in that same space we did last time. It's been a bit since we last chatted. So let's have you share a bit of the Adam Blai origin story for the listeners and viewers. This is their first time meeting you. Give them a little bit of context.
Well, I've been working for the church now for about 15, little more than that, years. Formally, in terms of full-time employment, for 10, but I've been helping out with the training of exorcists. Nationally for most of those years, but now internationally. So, trips overseas are starting to increase. I'm a layperson, not a priest. I got pulled into this starting with adult clinical psychology research in brainwaves and brain science, and wanted to know if any of these strange experiences were real or an artifact of the brain. Turns out that they're real, and spirits are real, and God's real. Not that I didn't believe before, but I was curious because I knew the brain could produce false experiences. And so once I realized things were real, I kind of dedicated my life to it because there was a lot of extraordinary suffering and relatively few people working in that area. There was very few exorcists in at least this country, the United States, back when I started 15 years ago. And we've done a number of, national conferences, and now there's a training institute in Chicago. And instead of God being done with me, I seem to continue to be asked to work in this area. In addition to that, in terms of I work for the church, I work in the tribunal, which is like the court of the church. And I'm wrapping up a degree, God willing, in canon law this year. And so, just trying to keep many irons in the fire, write a book a year in my copious spare time and enjoy life.
Well, it sounds like you haven't slowed down since we last spoke. I'd like to pull a little bit more on the origin story thread in terms of some of those early years. I think you were a part of kind of a paranormal interest group in college, and that's kind of what got you started. Talk to us a little bit about how some of those early haunted house cases set the groundwork or kind of set this all in motion to you. I feel like that's an interesting part of your story.
Yeah, so there really weren't many of those. So I was, as opposed to being like an undergrad in a paranormal interest group, I was actually the staff advisor for a paranormal interest group, because I was a grad student at the time, and grad students could be the kind of university overseer for a group. But almost immediately, the two cases that were part of launching me on this. One was the Brownsville Road case, and I can say that because a book's been written about it by the owner of the home. And that one, we were asked by the Pittsburgh Diocese to go in and take a look at the family. And my main thing was to look at the family more psychologically, because the church had been working on the case a long time, and they wanted to get a fresh set of eyes on it. And then another case that started out seeming to be a haunted house, and it was, in a sense, a famously haunted house because it had been written up in a local newspaper in Pittsburgh twice, and I saw those articles the homeowner had, well, not owner, renter. And the black thing that appeared over the kitchen table, which they took a picture of, appeared with such a bang, it was kind of like a gun going off, and everybody shot back from the table involuntarily, and the reporters fled. So they took that picture when it happened and tapped out. But anyway, it turned out that the person there went under possession while we were there. And that was I had never even thought about possession, really. And this was unlike anything I had seen clinically in terms of, in the psych clinic or in terms of research. I had done a master's on brain organization changes with consciousness shifts with hypnosis, which, of course, for Catholics, we shouldn't engage in hypnosis. But back in those days, we were, I didn't know that, and we were doing it as research. So, yeah, really, it was a short-lived, that was basically a way to meet the people that had these complaints for myself. back in those days, there was no paranormal craze. You have to understand it was extremely rare. The TV show Ghost Hunters was just coming out. That was the first TV show. You were still an oddball, and it was still, a bizarre waste of time to look into those kind of things. And of course, now it's, everybody's in their grandma's attic with an EVP recorder. Yeah, so I quickly learned that there is a real spiritual world, and it's much more serious than ghost hunting. And then as time has gone on, I've learned very clearly that ghost hunting is actually incredibly dangerous. Literally, scripturally, necromancy means calling the dead to talk to them. So ghost hunters, kind of by definition, are doing necromancy because they're using some type of device or some way to interact and saying, come here and give me a sign of your presence in some way. Sometimes a voice over a recorder, etc. So basically, what you're getting there, and I know people probably roll their eyes, but really what you're getting there is demons that are going to pretend to be your grandma or some dead person who died in the house or something else. There are poor souls that manifest in rare cases where God allows it, manifesting a need for prayer, but they don't respond to ghost hunting because they're not going to draw you into sin. So that's a bit of a rambling answer, but yeah, very quickly I kind of, like a rock skipping on water, I was, touched that area and realized, oh, this is much more serious than anything I had imagined. And then through Providence, I met specialist clergy pretty quickly on that case in Brownsville. And doors just kept opening from there. So God kind of ushered me along pretty quickly down that road.
Anything in particular in terms of that is so many of these early days in this space popping up on the East Coast? I mean, I think of Ed and Lorraine Warren and lots of other people I've encountered. Maybe it's just because that's the oldest part of the country or something. I don't know. But I just think so many of the early cases and stories and people who were intrigued and kind of the pioneers in the space, it was all on that East Coast area.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. Hans Holzer was in New York, I believe. Ed and Lorraine were in Connecticut, just north of New York. One of the few exorcists that was operating in those days was Father James Labar, and he was out of Hyde Park, New York. So for some reason, the Northeast was had a lot of that going on. And then you saw, at least some of the darker occult stuff going on the West Coast. So, yeah, I don't know the reason for it, but it certainly seems to be the case.
Just sharing a pattern I see. If I ever figure it out why, I'll let you know. In terms of the new book, kind of story behind the book, like why this book now, and kind of the audience, like what were you shooting for? Because I think last time we talked about your book, Hauntings, Possessions, and Exorcisms, or something. I think that's the title. What was the impetus for this new project?
Well, a Jesuit friend of mine who has done some work in this area, a good buddy. I'd wrapped up the book on miracles, which came after the one you mentioned. And I said, hey, Father, what do you think? What should I do next? And he immediately said, case studies. That would be useful. So the challenge, as you might be able to imagine, is, number one, obviously you have to change all the details so nobody's identifiable, right? So you have to protect people's privacy and respect their confidentiality. So you just the facts of the case and then change all the personal details and locations and whatnot. But beyond that, the bigger problem is how much do you share with the public, because you realize you're, various types of people with little or no or lots of catechesis or understanding of this stuff are going to read this. And you don't want to give people, one, you don't want to just scare them and horrify them, because honestly, if you were to write the horrible things that are done to people by demons, no publisher would publish it. They just would refuse because it would be too gross. I mean, imagine writing a book on, just horrific crimes in the detail of the crime being committed. It would just be disgusting, and nobody would want to read that. There would be sickos that would want to read it, but no publisher would publish it, right? So you can't really tell the full story of the ugly side of it. And then you have to be careful about how much about the exorcism you share because you don't want to give people the false impression that they can just go out and do this themselves. Um, and then you have to warn them very strongly that you really need to rule out the medical and the mental health before you jump to the conclusion it's possession or a demon. That's a huge issue because a lot of suffering people jump to that hypothesis without ruling out the medical or the psychological. And if you go along with them, you can do a lot of harm by encouraging that belief when you haven't ruled out the other stuff. So boy, there's so many hurdles. And so what I tried to do with the book, as I was working on it and realized I want to tell the story so that the people get a cautionary tale, kind of like we used to share fables in order to teach kids lessons, right? So, the monster under the bridge, the troll under the bridge is going to get you if you play around, if you play on the bridge. And the idea there was to keep the kids from falling in the stream and drowning, right? But you tell it in an entertaining way so the fable conveys a cautionary message. Now, these aren't fables, these really happen, but it's that idea where I want to, instead of wagging the finger and saying, well, you shouldn't play with Reiki or tarot cards or black magic, which how much good is that going to do? I mean, we're rebellious by nature. You tell teenagers they shouldn't do something, the first thing they're going to do is do it. So, I wanted to honestly share, like, well, you shouldn't do this, but instead, let me tell you a story about somebody who did. And here's what happened, and here's how they got out of it through the help of the church. And here's some details about how that process went. Some of the stories are heavier on what happened in the exorcisms, but more of the personal aspects of that, as opposed to the nuts and bolts of how do you do an exorcism, which it's way too complicated. Even if you wrote a book just as a manual, which I've done, and that's only available to priests, it's not open to the public, it's not for sale. You can have hundreds of pages and you still haven't covered anywhere near the number of different things that you could run into. So anyway, it's a rambling way to say, I'm trying to share cautionary tales that are hopefully interesting to people, but will give them something to think about when they go ghost hunting or play around with the occult.
And for you, is there a balance to be struck in terms of not making the evil too big, or like and God bigger? Or because on the one hand, I always feel like the challenge in writing something like this is you don't want to glorify the evil or give evil more power than it really has. I think we might have talked about this last time. Like Hollywood makes evil big and God really small, and God always seems to be coming
Right.
up short. What's that balance to strike in sharing these kinds of stories for you?
Well, I mean, clearly God is God, and these things are merely creatures, right? So compared to God, they're no more effective or powerful than an earthworm. Like they're all like we're all on a plane, and then there's God above the plane, right? That's it. So they're not. Yes, if you let them into your life and you invite a relationship with them, well, they can then seem to be powerful because you've handed over the right to afflict you to them, and yes, they can do terrible things. But if you stay in a state of grace, and that means staying away from mortal sin, um, and you're pursuing God, you really usually don't have anything to worry about at all. So the important thing with this book was to show that, yes, when you decide to crawl into the swamp and wade around in it, yeah, you're going to get leeches on you. It's going to be nasty. You might even get sick or an infection from it. These are all analogies I'm using. Um, but the more important thing is you somebody can help pull you out of that swamp and clean you up, and you can move on with your life. And so it's about that relationship with God, that the person needs to pursue. They've usually chosen to go away from God. They've made that choice usually, and they've embraced this demonic relationship, with this deceptive spirit. So in the beginning, they may say, well, the demon seems really powerful. Why isn't God helping me? I'm having these extraordinary, sufferings and afflictions and attacks. But that's because they've entered into that relationship. It's kind of like the sad case of like a battered spouse who says, this person's an absolute terror. They're completely dominating my life. They're hurting me. But if they were just to get out of that house, that person would cease to have that power over them. So when you're in it, it seems like it's an overwhelming power. But when you see it in the context of the bigger culture, you can just walk away from it. Now, I'm not saying it's that easy that when you're possessed to just walk away. You need help, but yeah, that's kind of the idea.
Early on in the book, you have a chapter talking about kind of running the timeline from the late 1800s, mid 1800s spiritualism, and kind of up to the paranormal TV craze of today. Um, if you had to contrast, say, like with the Fox sisters and kind of the trickery there, some of that old spiritualism with what we see today, is what people are delving into today more dangerous than what we saw in those early days?
Um,
And maybe for the benefit of some people might not even know who the Fox sisters are. So maybe give like
yeah,
a quick elevator pitch version of who
sure.
they are, because they were significant in the history of spiritualism
Oh,
here
big
in the United
time.
States.
So there was these sisters in the 1800s in New York, upstate New York, and they were young teens, I believe, and they wanted to mess with their mom, and they had a string and an apple, and that they could pull the string and make the apple bump against the wall or the floor. And they told mom their room was haunted or the house was haunted, and they're hearing these knockings in the night. And mom, comes in and whatever and says, show me, probably looking for the possum that's sneaking into the walls or something. And the girls, make this knocking noise, and mom doesn't know they're tricking her, and they start asking questions and having the supposed spirit bump once for yes and twice for no or something like that. Anyway, mom is like, really impressed because she doesn't catch them with their little magic trick, meaning like stage magic. And boy, it explodes, and it spreads across, the United States. It spreads over into Europe. It becomes a really big deal. And that evolved pretty quickly into mediums. So a medium is usually a person who claims to have an ability to communicate to spirits, with spirits. And some of them are trance mediums where they invite the spirit to possess their body and speak with their physical mouth, just like you and I are talking. So that all became very popular. Table tipping became very popular. And, we have to remember there was no internet. This was pre-TV. Entertainment was hard to come by. It was, maybe radio if you were lucky enough to have a radio. And life was hard. And, a lot of work and not much leisure time. And so it really became the thing to do. For decades, people would pay a medium to come to the house and sit at the kitchen table and channel spirits and, whatever method they were using. So the reason it kind of is all the same, Sean, is that the demon, regardless of the gateway drug you're taking to start this process, pushes for more and more interaction. And then eventually it'll communicate to the person, we no longer need this intermediary step. If you give me permission, I can just speak into your mind. That's usually the turning point. And then once they give permission for that, it starts to be, well, now I want you to do these things today, but not those other things. And then almost invariably, it starts coming around to, well, I don't want you to read the Bible anymore. You don't need to. You're above all that now. I'm going to teach you a higher spirituality or whatever the lie is. And then eventually it's don't go to church or I'll hurt you. And it becomes a domineering situation. And then slowly over time, then it becomes torment. And then it becomes sleep deprivation and torment to the point the person's completely worn down um, and beside themselves. And then it becomes kill yourself. That's the only way the suffering's going to stop. Just kill yourself and come with us. We'll treat you well. It won't be so bad for you downstairs. Just kill yourself or let us possess you. Give us your body entirely, and then all this suffering can stop. And those are the two things that it basically always ends with is suicide or given to possession. And you have those two choices, or you just be, the person thinks they're just going to be tormented to death. And so that's kind of the inevitable process. And it can take days, weeks, months, years, depending on what the person's into and how deeply they're into it. But the demon is always gently pushing for more and more relationship, more and more submission. In the beginning, it's lying. It's pretending to be a spirit guide or your higher self or your grandma, your guardian angel, or whatever is going to make you drop your guard. And then as it gets more of hold on you, it starts becoming domineering over time, and eventually it becomes this evil, tormenting thing. And that process is it doesn't matter whether you're in the 1800s or now. So it doesn't matter if you do that with a digital recorder or it was table tipping in the 1920s.
I think one of the things for me that was most eye opening in reading your books and other books in this subject area is, we tend to think of these stories and, I watch a movie and something's over in 2 hours and it's fully resolved. Probably the most eye opening thing for me is that sometimes there are these ongoing cases where you might be working with somebody for years in terms of exorcism and trying to help them be delivered. I guess I think you share a case in chapter 10. I think it was like "Welcome to the Big Time, Kid." A case of a lady where it just went on for several years. Talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges of some of these prolonged cases.
Well, when you're talking about exorcisms, it's almost always prolonged. So 6 months to 2 years of weekly sessions is about the average for a full possession case. And Hollywood makes it out to be a 6.5 minute dramatic confrontation with some special effects and it's over. Um, but it just isn't that way. And there's a few reasons for that. The most important reason, and it can be hard for people to get this quickly, is God is allowing all this because he wants spiritual conversion. So the person has basically drifted or ran away from God and embraced a deceptive spirit and then subjugated themselves to that deceptive spirit to the point where they're either going to be damned, dead, or both. And so God allows them to see the truth of what they've embraced so that they reject it and run back to God because he loves them and doesn't want them to be destroyed by this thing that has seduced them. Now, that conversion continues throughout the process of the exorcisms. And of course, people may not know this. It's not just one demon. Again, Hollywood makes it out to be one, impressive demon, and that's it. It's always a colony. It's like an onion with many, many layers. Because by the time somebody comes in for help, they've usually been possessed for years or decades. They may not have fully understood what was going on to them in the beginning, but as it gets worse and worse, eventually they come in, but they've layered on so many layers of concessions to the spirit in various ways that the demon is pushed for, that there's many other demons in there. And so you're peeling that onion a few every week. And then also God is looking for that conversion of the person, not just them to say, I'm suffering, bail me out, but God, I trust you. I love you. I want you in my life. Help me, Jesus. As opposed to like, this hurts, make it go away. That's kind of just a short-sighted approach. God wants you to not just like, pull the thorn out of your hand and then go back to what you were doing, because that's not going to help you. You're just going to end up in the same condition and 5 years down the road. And so that conversion is really the more important thing. And then the fact that there's many demons, and the person can only handle so many coming out per week, in the sense of it's a dramatic psychological and emotional shift, because this is something that's often been in them emotionally, psychologically, physically. Though it's a spirit, it has no physicality, but their personality is wrapped up in this thing and has been affected by this thing as they've matured through life. And so as you pull out a fundamental piece of yourself, even though it's an alien cancerous piece that shouldn't have been there, when you yank that out, the whole system kind of reacts. And some people will say, I didn't know who I was or how to be. I feel so disoriented after that thing was taken away. And so there's only so much God removes each week. And then the person kind of settles down and figures out and, emotionally is wobbly for a few days and kind of gets on their feet. And then they're ready for the next layer to come.
Well, and I'll say too, in terms of the cases you share in the book, many of them read like something out of a movie. But I think as parents, probably the one that will tug on our heartstrings is you share the story about a psychic kid who goes on a TV show, and then when that show airs, there's this dramatic shift that happens. Tell us kind of the short version of that story. That I don't know if I want to say it's my favorite story of the book, but as a parent, I was like, oh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it was, one of these shows that I think was a terrible idea, kind of on the surface, on a common sense level, but that was to Um, find kids that think they have psychic powers or abilities, and then bring in adult psychics to coach them and encourage them to go deeper with it on camera. And some of the people in that show, like the adults that were doing it, I know them. I don't think they have bad intentions, but I think it was a misguided show. So anyway, this particular case, quite a young lady at the time, as the show was airing, and the whole family was there to see her on TV, because that's a big deal if your 12 or 13-year-old is going to be on TV. So the whole extended family is there to watch and whatnot. Um, yeah, and as her episode, I guess, was getting towards the end of airing, she fell on the floor and went into a possession state that scared the family pretty badly, and of course terrified her. It was no fun. And so, yeah, that was a case I worked on many years ago now. They're now pretty much grown up and moved on and whatnot. But it was an interesting case. A couple visits there, and it seemed to run in the family. At least that's what the family told me. A certain sensitivity to spirits, not possession, a sensitivity to spirits, which that can be part of life. Some families seem to have more of that than others. Don't exactly know why God does that, but it's there. And so the demons took advantage of that sensitivity and tricked her. And then I think by promoting, my guess is that by promoting the idea of pursuing psychic powers just for either selfish reasons or for attention or something, that's when the demon showed itself. And basically she had served her purpose from the demon's perspective, is my guess. And so then it showed itself and turned on her, because the show was done, the promotion was out there, more people were then seduced into the same deception, and so it turned on her. And she was freed, by the way. So that was good.
Yes, the happy ending to that story. I think in terms of what we see in film portrayals, somebody plays with the Ouija board or kind of these common gateways. But you also have a chapter in the book talking about Reiki and yoga, and I think that's an area where people go, it's spiritual healing, but they don't often connect it to, say, maybe the demonic roots and demonic circumstances they might be throwing themselves into. Talk to us a little bit about the dangers of those things, because I think people don't often get what they're stepping into with that.
Yeah, so it's a big conversation, but the short version is, so Reiki was a supposed physical and emotional healing thing that you could learn to do through spiritual powers, and in order to gain those spiritual powers, you would go to a training here, at least here in the West. This started in Japan, but here in the West, you would go to a training, pay your $200 or $300, get certified as a Reiki master. But spiritually, what you had to do, and you can YouTube this later and see, it's pretty disturbing to watch, but it's out there. To get initiated, so in a Reiki initiation, you have to make a verbal request, a consent of the will, asking for the Reiki spirit to be attached to you that's going to facilitate these supposed powers. And then this person who already has the spirit in them or attached to them lays hands on you, and then takes a oil and draws symbols on your palms, draws symbols in the air over your head, and does various kind of, yeah, basically a form of anointing and laying on of hands after an assent of the will, saying that you want the Reiki spirit connected with you. Um, and I've seen cases where, yeah, it turned on them, usually after they had promoted Reiki for quite a long time. And then again, they maybe had served their purpose from the spirit's perspective, it turned on them. Yoga is a huge topic, but kind of the first few bumps in the road, I think, are to consider that you're taking worship postures for pagan gods and you're doing them as a stretching exercise. Understand that, like and here's where the woke world maybe would agree. You're culturally appropriating the physical postures out of a Hindu lifestyle, a religion where it's an entire lifestyle, diet, prayers, meditation, physical exercise. It's an entire holistic lifestyle centered around these religious beliefs, and you're plucking out one part of it and then basically pretending that you're spiritual and that's your spirituality. In a sense, and I've seen some comments from real Hindu masters, in India, it's pretty insulting that Westerners are culturally appropriating one sliver of their system and saying this is the part we enjoy and that makes us spiritual. There's various analogies I suppose you could come up with this if you were to like take the rosary out of Catholicism and say, I just find these beads really soothing. I don't believe in Mary or Jesus or God, but I find the beads really soothing. So I say these words and, move the beads. It would be a little bit weird, to a Catholic for somebody to be doing that. So anyway, some of the deeper stuff gets pretty dark. And I'm actually working on a situation right now with somebody who grew up in India and is getting out of this stuff. They happen to live here in the States. And boy, Sean, I had no idea how dark it got in terms of the inner workings of what goes on in the full yoga lifestyle when you're fully ensconced in one of these. They're usually centered around some particular guru. A lot of money goes in that person's direction, a lot of attention and volunteer time and everything else. But there's a lot of creepy stuff. There's a lot of basically what sounds more like negative witchcraft, like the ability to curse people, the ability to wrest money away from people in the world and get ahead of others, even physically harm other people by appealing to these deities that you've paid off enough through your activities for them to owe you a favor. It gets pretty dark. And the final kind of bigger hurdle is there's a sub part of yoga called Kundalini yoga, and with a K, and been around since at least the 70s, but the idea of kriyas and these other manifestations have been around much longer, but it was packaged for the West in the 70s. And the idea there is that they believe every human being has the spirit of a serpent at the base of their spine, and that you can awaken this serpent through these breathing meditations of various types, and it will move up your spine slowly over the days, weeks, or months until it reaches the top of your head, and then it'll produce kriyas, which are signs of spiritual activity. And those are specifically involuntary body motions and jerking movements and animal-like vocalizations you can't control. So, and then there's a whole host of videos on YouTube of people that have had these Kundalini awakenings and have just had their lives wrecked for months or years afterwards. Just all kinds of levels of disturbance. So, if one were to only do the physical part and just do stretches, I would still say you're culturally appropriating worship postures from a religion versus something that's designed to be good for exercise. Like if you were to say kneeling in a church, and then we're going to appropriate that and say that's something for developing your posture. Like it wasn't designed, it wasn't optimized to develop your posture. You could maybe argue that maybe it could because you're holding your back and holding yourself up through your supporting muscles, but it would be a weird argument. Whereas there are exercise systems that have been designed by physiologists that are optimized with the way the body moves that actually help you in terms of being limber and exercising. So there's a bunch of strange arguments you have to kind of make it make sense. And I think the bottom line is people just like the Eastern mysterious kind of pseudo mysticism aspect of it. It's kind of like a spirituality of sugar. I can eat the sugar and feel good for a minute, but it doesn't have any lasting real benefit for most people. So it's I think it really appeals to a Western audience of like give me it now. I want instant gratification, and I don't want too much work.
Man, spirituality is sugar. That could be a name for a weird candy store or something. If you want to, somebody run with that. I love that. That was a good good and a fun example. In terms of kind of the reader's journey with the book, I find with these sorts of stories, people will like fixate on one or two stories that really stuck out to them in a book like this. But in terms of the thread you want them to see throughout and kind of the takeaway, what's that core impact you hope every reader has from their journey with the Exorcism Files?
Well, the most important thing would be that God is real, and you're living in a world that God is allowed to be a testing ground. And there are various beings that are trying to get you off the path back to God, that we have the ability to make it back to God. These fallen creatures don't. They're bitter about that. And I want them to take that journey and see the various overtures that are going to be presented to them through life. Not that they're going to see all of these overtures from the demonic, but our culture is celebrating these routes to demonic bondage. We used to just know that you shouldn't play with these things. You know, it was just baked into Western civilization. You don't play with spirits. Necromancy's bad. Ouija boards are bad. You know, you don't play with that stuff. And now it's the opposite. You know, there's Ouija boards for little girls that are pink at Toys R Us, and there's 1,000 paranormal TV shows, and everything is portrayed as harmless and fun. And that's not the case. And so just to take that journey, learn from the people that have gone before you, you know, instead of saying, I'm going to reinvent the wheel and figure it out myself. There's a few things that it's worth tapping into the experience of others and just avoid them. You know, examples are like heroin, right? How many times do we have to hear stories about how destructive heroin is to where you say like, yeah, you know, I don't need to try that for myself. I'm hoping that at some point, some readers or people that consume this type of stuff will have that kind of moment where they'll say, you know, I don't need to play with this stuff. But the most important thing is God is real. Pursue God with your whole heart, your whole being. That's the purpose of your journey in life. You know, you may have a ministry of parenthood, you may have different things that God's asking you to do in life, but your primary job is to love others and love God. So he's there to help you if you're starting to get into trouble. You know, your local church is the place to start. You know, just your local parish, if you're Catholic, your local minister, if you're Protestant, you know, whatever your religion is, if it's a good religion, that's the place to start. But you know, continue for the rest of your life pursuing God.
And Adam, in terms of connecting with you, finding out more about your books, where do we discover you on the web?
Well, I don't use social media. I have no interest in being connected with, in a sense. I can only work on cases in my own diocese because that's how the church is organized. It's organized by diocese. So if you live in a different diocese, I can only, you know, I give some general advice to the public about these things. But if I can't start weighing in on a particular situation with the person, because you need to evaluate the situation, figure out what's going on before you can give advice. And I just can't do that because if you're in another diocese, I have to respect that bishop and their authority, and you have to, you know, call the office of the diocese you live in. I have some information for the public on religiousdemonology.com. So that may be helpful to people.
And like we do with every episode, we'll make it easy. We'll have a link to any websites mentioned in the description or show notes for the episode. We'll also have links to places you can pick up your very own copy of the book we've talked about as well. It's time to bring this episode of the Sean Tabbitt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Adam Blai. Once again, our book today was The Exorcism Files, True Stories of Demonic Possession. And Adam, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and truly a pleasure to have you back in the show.
It's been good to be here, Sean. God bless you and your listeners.